Hey everybody, it's Miss Flesher. I am here to talk to you today a little bit about revision. I have just revised my cultural story, and so I want to just give you some insight on what it is that I revised and how I knew to revise it. So, as you start thinking about revision, I think it's important that we clarify what revision is and how it's different from editing. So, revision is really an opportunity to come back to your story after you've had some feedback and a little bit of time away. Hopefully, you have some fresh eyes that you're looking at this piece with. And when you come back to revise, you can re-see the way that you want the story to be told. Often after we code or we receive feedback, we know exactly where we want to center our attention so that we know that the parts of our revised pieces that we're going to fix are even stronger than the original piece. I think the biggest difference between revision and editing is just the idea of how much it impacts your overall paper. So with editing, I always think that we're just doing small little fix-ups, like we are trying to make sure that our punctuation looks great, our capitalization is fully done. That's a much more simple, focused project. Revision is more holistic, meaning it requires you to look at the entire piece that you are revising and to think through how you can substantively change it. Revision is something that is really important to me personally because it's changed my relationship with writing. We all know that writing is a process, and revision is a really important part of that process for both you and for your reader. For your reader, it really helps because when you go back with fresh eyes, you can see maybe the things that you said that weren't super clear in your first draft, and you can make those things clearer to your reader. Now, what I think is really important about revision is that I am learning that for me, writing is a learning experience in and of itself. So I've talked to a lot of you guys about how sometimes the greatest struggle that we have in English class is putting our thoughts on the paper. And I think that in the act of creating a first draft, that is helping you clarify your thinking. And once you do that, the learning becomes clearer in your own head. When you go back and revise things, that's when you actually start to take your writing from being for you as the learner and the writer to being for your reader. I feel like every first draft I do is for me. That first draft is for me to get a sense of what it is that I'm trying to say and clarify my thinking about a subject, whether I'm writing about myself or whether I'm writing about a book I've just read. Anytime I do a second draft, it's only after I've had all of the word vomit of the first draft, honestly, to process what I'm thinking about. That second draft allows me to take that word vomit and refine it so that it makes sense to someone else. So for me, this is how I get over writer's block. I just accept that my first draft is for me, my second draft is for someone else. So as I revise, I always ground myself in a couple of different questions. So what do I need to do to my writing piece in order to better complete the task that I'm trying to do? So if I am revising my story, I need to go back and look at the storytelling standard. If I'm writing an essay, I want to go back and look at the essay standard. What is written in that standard that I need to make sure I've taken care of in my writing piece? I also always want to think about who my audience is for the piece and what I need to do to make sure that they walk away from my piece understanding exactly what it is that I'm trying to show them. There are a few different strategies for making sure that you're doing meaningful revision and not just making small little edits. So you want to start by going back to the comments or the things that you noticed when you were coding your own work. You also want to take a look at the feedback that you received from your teacher or your writing partner. So maybe you have had a peer review session where your peer has given you feedback. You've definitely had a writing conference where you've talked about next steps with your teacher. I think those are things I think about like before I start the process. And then once I'm actually in it, I use the ARMS strategy, which I'm going to talk about here in just a minute. That helps me make sure that the changes I'm making are meaningful. So when I say the ARMS strategy, I'm just talking about adding details. Sometimes I want to make sure I'm paying attention to the techniques. So if I'm writing a story, I want to pay attention to narrative techniques. If I'm writing an essay, I want to pay attention to the analysis techniques. And I want to make sure that I'm transitioning smoothly between each paragraph. The R of ARMS is removing parts that don't contribute to your overall message, lesson, or claim. This is the hardest for me. One of my best friends calls this killing your darlings, which means that those parts of writing that you wrote, and maybe you've got like a beautiful turn of phrase, but it's not really serving your overall message. If it's not serving your message, it doesn't matter how beautiful that sentence is, you gotta take it out. To make that process easier, I always keep a journal where I write down the darlings that I have removed from my stories so I don't have to say goodbye to them entirely. For me, moving and rearranging the sections of my draft is always something that I find helps me a lot in revision. So you'll see that here in just a second when I talk through my example. And then the last thing that you want to do is just go back, look through some of your words or sentences that might not be super interesting. Try to think about how you could maybe use more varied sentence structure or stronger vocabulary to add a little bit more oomph in those places. And I have a little note here that says, like, just as with our coding work, you don't have to do all of these things to make sure that you have a strong piece. But if you don't have one of these things on here, then you need to have a justification for why. It shouldn't be an accident that you have just skipped over the removal piece. Okay, so I'm really quickly going to just walk you through my example of how I revised. So when I sat down to revise, the very first thing I did was pull up my learning tracker and look at what I said I wanted to improve in my cultural story. So I said, I think I'm getting close to the standard, but I don't love the way my story ends. I want to revise my ending to make sure I have more falling action and that the timeline makes sense to my readers. Cool. So I know that I did that based on, I know I wrote this based on the comments I made on my coded draft. So I'm going to go back to my coded draft and see where I want to specifically focus. One thing that I did as I left my coded draft is I put these little asterisks next to the comments that I wanted to revisit in my revision. So I'm going to take a second to read through those. Okay, so as the writer, I feel like this is the turning point of my story because it's the moment when I realized everything was going to be okay. But I just realized that the second half of this moment is in the beginning of my story. I used it as a hook. I wonder if it's important for my readers to see the relief I felt down here so they know this interaction helped me feel safe and excited. I think I need to think through that more in my revision. And actually, I remember that when I was making the video about my learning tracker, I said I wanted to take my opening scene and move it to the bottom of my story. So that sounds to me like I'm going to need to move that, and then I'm going to need to figure out how to make my opening scene feel okay again once I've taken out that really strong example of writing. See, yeah, here is where the moment should go. I skipped over it here because I didn't want to be repetitive, but the moment doesn't work down here. So I am going to add it right here. And then I'm going to come back and think through how I'm going to do that. So I have looked over my comments. So now I feel ready to like actually approach revision. So pretend I'm revising right now. Oh, hey, it's a revised cultural story. Cool. All right, so some changes I want to walk you through really quickly. I started by moving my memory moment, beginning right here, down to the bottom where I said that I wanted it. So I still start the story in the same place, but I moved my flashback moment so that it happens a little bit later, and I took the opening moment where I was taking a sip of coffee down here. So this is now part of my falling action and my turning point. That was really important to me because I felt like I had a pretty long story, and I felt like it wasn't, the relief that I felt in the end wasn't truly felt. So this is a story about the day that I moved to Seattle and how on that day I was feeling really scared and really uncomfortable. A lot of things were just starting to hit me, like I was moving 2,500 miles away from everybody who had ever loved me except for Eli. And it was the moment that I walked into my first Seattle coffee shop that I was like, oh, it's going to be okay. So I felt like it was important to have that at the end because my character or myself, I needed that resolution to happen at the end of my story rather than building tension at the beginning of my story. So that's what I achieved by moving it there. Once I moved it down though, I realized, like, if you look over here, if I just remove this for a quick second, you'll see I have like an introduction scene. The air surrounding me was filled with the plop, plop, plop of espresso beans dropping into hoppers, the squeal of frothers landing in pitchers of milk, and the chatter of friends laughing and catching up. Today had been such a long and eventful day, and although it was exciting, I was starting to get a little freaked out. This coffee shop felt like home, though. It reminded me of the bookstore cafe where I'd worked in college, the place that helped me grow into the person I'd become. So then I immediately flashed back in time to the application process for the bookstore. It's fine, but I ultimately felt like my beginning felt really empty here. So what I did is I moved some of the exposition that I'd had in later parts of my story up so that I can provide a little bit more context for my introduction. So now I have a big long exposition here at the beginning that is explaining why we've moved before I go back into time. You'll see that in my second draft here, this is the draft that I coded. My first flashback goes to August 2006, where I'm applying for a job in the cafe. I decided when I was doing my revision, though, that my audience really needed to understand, like, I gave them a great deal of exposition talking about, like, why we moved, but I never really explained why cafe culture was something that was really important to me. So I felt like I needed to do that. And honestly, that didn't come from a place where, like, that didn't come from me working in the bookstore cafe. It actually came from me, like, hanging out at this place called the Blue Moose Cafe when I lived in Morgantown, West Virginia. So I wrote a little bit of exposition here about the first time that I went to the Blue Moose with my very best friend and how that place became my home over the next few years. It was my study sanctuary. It was my Friday night hangout spot. It was the place where I felt really seen in an area of the country where I often did not feel like I was at home. So that was a really important thing for me to include because I think without this moment, none of the rest of it makes sense. It doesn't make sense why a latte at the end of this story would be so comforting to me. So I needed to add in some information about like how I have been taken care of in coffee shops before and why that's something that's meaningful to me. I think that is pretty much all of the changes that I want to highlight. When I post this video, I'll probably go ahead and post both versions of my story so you can take a look at it if you want to dig a little bit deeper into some of those changes. But my video is already at 15 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and call it for here. Good luck on your revisions. You guys have great instincts. I'm excited to see where you're going with your stories.